Over now to Cassidy.
All right, thank you, Phil. As you said, I was invited here to talk about the institutional perspective around altmetrics and how they might fill the evaluation gap. But I have to make one correction. Although I love librarians, I am not a librarian. So I'm an assistant professor in the School of Informatics and Computing, and I do research on the scholarly communication system. So let me start here with the motivations, right? Why are we trying to find a way to use altmetrics to fill the evaluation gap? Why do altmetrics seem like a useful thing to fill the evaluation gap? Well, part of this comes from research assessment exercises, and perhaps the most well-known of these is the REF, which replaced its predecessor, the RAE, in the UK. Research Excellence Framework is one of the best-known federal cases of doing assessment of research. Now, one important change in 2014, when they changed the metric, was how they were going to evaluate units. So 65% of it went to the output, right? That is what the unit is producing. How much are they producing and where are they producing it? 15% went to environmental concerns, and 20% went to impact. Now, this isn't a fundamental change. They've always looked at impact, but they've largely done that using citation-based indices and peer review. And they decided to operationalize impact in a very specific way in the 2014 REF. And they said impact is any effect on, change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment, or quality of life, comma, beyond academia. This was no longer looking at science on science, but science on society and trying to understand the impact that all of this research is having on society. And this constituted 20% of the criterion for evaluating and allocating resources to these units. So suddenly these units had to say, how can we do that? How can we demonstrate that we are having an impact on society, that we are having an impact that goes beyond academia? Also, in the US, we have the National Science Foundation, whereas we don't have the same sort of research excellence framework, the same sort of evaluation exercise. We have a government institution that gives resources, and as soon as it gives resources, it begins to make criteria for how we evaluate science. Now, broader impacts has always been a part of the National Science Foundation's criteria, but they have recently changed this, modified these criteria slightly. So as you can see, they're looking at broadening dissemination to the general public, benefits to society that come from commercialization, from entrepreneurial activities within science. Again, looking beyond science on science to science on society. Now, at the institutional level, the best documents that we can use are promotion and tenure documents. In no other document is our incentive structure, our norms around science, more codified than in these documents. So I take, for example, the one from Indiana University, the one which I'm most familiar with, and it says we need to start looking on our impact on diverse communities, students and other people in the communities, but also people outside academy. And public scholarship gets a placement as a type of work that we should be investing in, that we should be incentivizing, that we should be encouraging in higher education. So all of these kinds of documents are stressing the importance of having an impact on society, having an impact on the general public. So where does altmetrics fit in? Why will altmetrics help us to do that, help us to demonstrate our impact? Well, we can start with the vision of it by Jason Priem, who coined the term. In a chapter in our book, Beyond Bibliometrics, he says 3 things about altmetrics that are really important. One is he says it's an approach to uncovering previously invisible traces of scholarly activities. That is, there is so much that a scholar does, but so little that we actually capture, and altmetrics can do that. He places this as an alternative to, not a supplement, but an alternative to citations, saying citations miss important kinds of impact, and furthermore, citations are embedded in this terrible publishing system that we have right now, and it's too slow, it's too codgy, it doesn't capture science, which is messy and dynamic and exciting. And altmetrics can do that, he claims. So this promise is simply that the academic does a lot of things, right? They teach, they go to conferences like this one, they publish, they analyze data, they share data sometimes they have private lives, and all of these things constitute what a scholar does. And wouldn't it be great if we could capture that? Because citations, the terrible thing stuck inside the publishing system, only does one thing. It looks at the publishing activity in relation to the publishing activity of other scientists. And the claim is that altmetrics is going to enliven all of these things, to make visible, to make manifest that which has been previously hidden. And in doing so, show us the impact on society, show us the impact on those students, on the general public, on teachers, on politicians. So what's the data that we can use for that? At the institutional level, what would we do to be able to capture some of these data? Well, as been presented, article-level metrics are perhaps the most widely used altmetric form, right? Now, the problem, the critique of this is, isn't that just still science on science? Isn't that still just one node of what a scholar does? Are we really broadening the conversation? But they do show us something different, right? Not science to another scientific article, but tweets, Facebook, newspaper posts to this article. Now, at the institutional level, this is used in two ways. One is incorporation into institutional repositories. So being able to incorporate that, show article-level metrics on the things that are produced in an institution. Secondly, it's also used by the scientists themselves as they start to work in their reputation management and sort of the self-promotion that we've talked about to see what impact their particular article had on the wider world. The second is these composites, these individual rankings, where we can find altmetric scores for an individual person. Now, Impact Story is probably the most well-known of these services, run by Jason Priem and Heather Puvovar, and funded by the Sloan Foundation. Now, the problem with this is there's a cost associated with it. So it's been a bit slow in the uptake because researchers are reticent to invest money to get a portfolio of their impact online. And the third things are tools and services that are targeted explicitly at institutions. So Mendeley's Institutional Edition is one example of this. Now what they say is we can take all of this readership data that's affiliated with your institution, researchers who are from Indiana University, and we can put it all together to say, what are the students who are at your institution reading? What are the faculty reading? What are the researchers reading? What are they saving? What is their interaction with those documents? And this can be very useful for librarians in collection development. Now, in many ways, this isn't anything novel. It's a new way to do an old thing, right? We've had counter statistics, there's usage statistics, we've had readership counts before. But this is one way of tracking these novel metrics in some of the old ways that we've used them in other ways. Now, who's supporting, who's encouraging, who's incentivizing this activity at institutions? Well, as you've seen, it's almost exclusively librarians who are doing this. So this University of Maryland library says, here's how to use altmetrics, here's Plum Analytics, here's altmetric, and here's how you can use it to promote yourself. Here's how you can use it to get promotion and tenure. Similarly, Duke University goes one step further. They don't just show you where you can get these data, but they tell you how to put them in your CV. They give you a new format, and they say, it's really important to contextualize. Don't just say how many tweets, but tell us what ranking you were. Use the altmetric scores. Really give us more data. And they provide a template now for how we're going to do this. But the one place that we're not seeing these is any change in those promotion and tenure documents. You'd be hard-pressed to find the word altmetric in any promotion and tenure document. Now, some of you may say, well, institutions are slow-moving ships, right? Altmetrics are new, and over time we'll see them. But there are several other challenges other than just recency that's causing concern. So Wouters was introduced earlier, and in 2012 he undertook a comprehensive study of altmetric tools, and he concluded that altmetrics need a far stricter protocol of data quality and indicator reliability and validity before it can be used for impact assessment. Simply put, these metrics weren't ready. They weren't standardized enough. We didn't know where they were coming from or what they meant. Now you may say, well, that was 3 years ago. Things have certainly changed. Well, Wouters also published the Leiden Manifesto, which Phil mentioned earlier just a few months ago, and he acknowledged the proliferation of things, and he goes, you know, they're usually well-intentioned, they're not always well-informed, and they are often ill-applied. And I think that this falls not only for citation-based metrics, but also for altmetrics. Now, some of the concerns are the same concerns we've had with citation-based indicators before, right? We have coverage problems. There are wide differences in coverage. This shows one study we did of biomedical journals showing the degrees of coverage and also the correlation with citation. And you see the span across this coverage for one very specific domain. If you were to overlay all domains within the knowledge, you'd see huge differences in how much coverage these journals are receiving on social media. Now, you'll say, okay, but we had that problem with citation, and we still use citation-based indicators. But the problems are better known. Right now, we're still in the exploratory stage. We're trying to figure out which journals are online, how much are tweeted about, which communities are invested in these kinds of social media platforms. And until we know that, using these data cannot be done in a valid or reliable way. Secondly, we need to know who is tweeting. right? We make this claim that if an article is tweeted about, the public cared about it, right? That's the assumption, that the public is the one tweeting scientific articles. So we did a study of PLOS, Nature, Science, Nature, PLOS, and PNAS, and tweets to articles in there. 50% of those were from people who had PhDs or were on their way to getting those. 50%. That is a lot more than the proportion of US citizens who have a PhD, right? This is a very specific audience that's tweeting about science. So claiming that this is a social impact before we know that is highly problematic. Now, within those, it's very skewed as well, right? We have a lot of people in the sciences, not many in the other fields. Of course, this is part of the sampling of choosing Science, Nature, and PNAS. We also have gender disparities in this, with nearly 2/3 being male. And they're not all people. A lot of these, a quarter of these people are institutions, right? So we have to discriminate, are you an institution? What does that mean, having an impact on an institution versus an individual? Now, they're both important kinds of impact, but we need to understand them further before we can take for granted that a tweet means something, and means something monolithically. Furthermore, you may be a person, or you may be a cyborg, or you may be a bot, and we need to know that. That's hugely important when we're trying to ascertain any validity for metrics. So some of the studies we've done is taken from that person to organization, and then trying to figure out who is a bot, because people don't usually go around saying this Twitter handle is a bot. So one of the criteria we used was levels of engagement. If it's repeatedly just tweeting out the titles of articles with no change, what would just be pre-populated when you press that tweet button on a journal publisher's site, then you're more likely to be a bot than if you put in things like, I loved this article, it was great. If you make changes, expressions, sentiment in it, you're probably more likely to be a person. And you can see some of these examples, and it falls like that. We see things that actually declare themselves as bots, organizations, and other things are more likely to have automated tweeting functions than these individuals that we classified as humans or cyborgs rather than bots. We need to know more about this, right? If it's 2% are bots, that's one thing. If 30% are bots, that's quite another thing for interpreting the validity of metrics. And lastly, we need to know what it means when someone tweets. Does it mean it was useful to them, that it was transformative? Does it mean that it had utility, that they found it valuable? Right? So we have one example here of an article that received, about 4,000 tweets. And you can read the title, Can Apparent Superluminal Neutrino Speeds Be Explained as Quantum Weak Measurement? And the abstract says, probably not. And now if you look at those 4,000 tweets, they almost exclusively say, best abstract ever, right? So 4,000 people tweeting about a physics article, did it have societal impact? Well, maybe people thought about physics that day who wouldn't have otherwise thought about it. Maybe they went and read something afterwards, but it probably meant very little to them. It was humorous. And as the example already given by Wiley, should we cite the crappy Gabor paper, garnered nearly 7,000 tweets. And I can guarantee you those were not because of the scientific content of that article, right? And so these are mere examples to show that we are still trying to figure out what it means. Now, there are abuses and misuses of citation, but 7,000 articles will not be published with a humorous citation. There are peer review, there are standards, there's control. Now, things slip in, but not 7,000 things. So we need to understand this more, again, before we can appropriately assess the validity and reliability of these metrics. So where do we go from here? What does this mean for us? Well, openness is the word du jour. It's open data, open science, open access. Everything is open, and openness is beautiful and wonderful and good, right? We believe in openness. That's great. But openness also has its challenges. And just because something is open doesn't mean it needs to be feral, right? And we need to think about that. How can we harness the power of these metrics? They might be able to tell us something useful. We don't know for sure yet, but they might. But they need to be harnessed. They need to be understood. They need to be standardized. So thinking about standardization and unification of these data becomes increasingly important. NISO was funded by Sloan to begin to do this, to create standards for altmetrics, in the same way that we've thought about organizing author identity, same as Wiley promoted that as well, and in the same way that Spark tried to bring people together around open access. We need to think about ways that we can, in concert, come together to standardize, to unify these metrics if they are to be valid at all. My dream would look something like this, right? We have ORCID in the middle. We have the professor, and they usually look like that. And we have that person, and I want to know who they've mentored, what dissertations they've served on. I want to know their Twitter handle. I want to know their demographic characteristics. I want to know their publications across all sources, and I want to aggregate their metrics. Only then can we begin to realize that altmetric promise of bringing together holistically all of these things. This has to happen with librarians, with publishers, with academics, all working together. Everyone has to pay into this system in order to make it work. But just providing access, just unifying things, just giving data doesn't mean we're going to be able to overcome some of the disparities that we see in the scientific workforce. And we have to keep that in the back of our mind, that in some ways providing access actually amplifies disparities, and we have to be conscious of that as we move in this way. Providing openness, moving things to online platforms, incentivizing things that happen on online platforms predicates that people are on those online platforms, have access to the online platforms, and are going to use them in the same sorts of ways. So I'll close with my favorite quote, which is Campbell's, who says, "The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor." If altmetrics is out there to solve this evaluation gap, to help us evaluate research, we can't let it become an end in itself. We suffer from goal displacement already. We don't want to exacerbate that goal displacement by having tweet be the objective. Thank you.
Just in case there's any questions for the... any burning questions for... Yes, definitely, Phil.
Could you go to your last slide, please? What you're really saying is take the number out of the donut.
I don't know that quantification is necessarily goal displacement, right? So there are many amazing social engineering processes where you create an incentive that asks people to behave in the ways you want them to behave. What I'm concerned about with the donut altogether is that it incentivizes a lot of reputation management, which we heard about from Wiley before, and a lot of time invested on that, right? And time in self-promotion. It also means I'm going to try to research a subject that I know will be highly tweetable, right, in terms of another thing, right? Can we capture social impact in a way that makes people do the kinds of work that actually has social impact? Right? That's what I want to know. I want to know that the colors in that altmetric donut are really about people doing good in society, people having work that has utility in society. If those colors measured that, there's no problem with the number, right? The number is what it's actually measuring. Sarah?
Go, Sarah.
Again, I just want to push back a little bit because I feel like we're not working on a shared definition of altmetrics. I think we tend to want to talk about quantitative analysis around tweets because tweets in some ways are the easiest thing to quantify. But if you look at altmetrics as a measure of attention, a qualitative measure of attention that requires sentiment analysis on the part of a human, of a bot, to determine where the impact is, a lot of the examples that we give, I think, suddenly kind of fall to the wayside. Cracking the wallpaper, no, maybe not. Like, does peeing in the pool water make a difference? Okay, no, maybe not. But when a researcher can go into that data and see, I'm getting mentions in policy documents, I'm getting quoted in policy documents, or Twitter shows that early career researchers are using my papers because it helps them with their methodological work. Like, those are concrete, but they're not going to be accessible by a quantitative analysis that you're doing. So I'm just going to push back a little bit against your definition and the particular examples that you're showing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the realization of altmetrics for what it could provide would be fantastic. Unfortunately, the operationalization has not realized those goals.
Just to kind of build on that a little bit, so much of the criticism that you've put against altmetrics as it stands today has been based around tweets.
And tweets have been the most widely studied, and also correlations between citation and tweets and journal and article level metrics have been the most studied. The data is the most readily available. Altmetric makes that data available, which is fantastic. But we need better data on more diverse things in order to be able to use altmetrics in meaningful ways.